Hi, this is Hayley from Technic Motorsport, and I'm going to do something a little bit different today. One of the main goals of our social media account is not only to entertain, but it's also to showcase the technical side of what we do here. I asked Nick about the platinum valves that Greg was assembling one day, and this is what he told me. Watch Greg assemble these while I tell you the story from Nick's perspective. I need to tell the story of how I came up with this confounded thing, because it's not actually my design. I can't take any credit for it. I'll explain how it came to be and what the process was. The problem with damper rod forks is well known. They make next to no low-speed damping and then ramp up in a progressive fashion. From my dyno testing, they don't really make any high-speed damping either. You feel like the fork hits a wall, as there's no damping to support the fork. What they do is create a progressive damping curve, which means your low-speed chassis control is non-existent and you have a lot of trouble controlling the oil because it just bleeds everywhere internally. Any attempt to run a thicker, more viscous oil doesn't really achieve what you want. People say, oh, they work better with a 15 weight rather than a 10 weight. From my dyno testing, it makes almost no difference at all, confirming the feel riding the bike. The first attempt to make a damper rod fork perform better happened in around 1984. When Kawasaki made the KYB designed TCV or travel control valve a production part. It was a spring and basically a poppet. They put it under the spring on top of the damper rod and that gave them some control and compression. It was a halfway house between the cartridge fork being launched in I think 87 or 88 on the KX 125, 250 and 500. It was just a way to make the damper rod work a little bit better. Most aftermarket valves can trace their origin back to the original KYV TCV. The first person to really popularise putting a valve on top of a damper rod was Paul Theed at Racetech. He made his cartridge emulators in the very late 80s, or maybe the early 90s. Again, it was a poppet style with a check plate for rebound. You could adjust the spring pressure on the poppet, you could change the spring rate. He would also sell blank poppet plates, so if you wanted to change your bleed and have more or less bleed for different applications, road, dirt, whatever, you could. He made them from brass, which is a perfectly acceptable material, and in a variety of sizes to suit different forks. That same emulator is still in production today, virtually unchanged. What has changed is that Racetech has made quite a few adapters, so they fit a multitude of forks. When I first started Technic in 2001, I needed a damper rod valve for workshop jobs. One of the business hurdles I had was that the Racetech distributor in Australia refused to sell me any parts at all because they viewed me as a competition. This was sort of comical because at that stage of the business, it was just me rattling around in a factory unit trying to work out what I was doing. So I ended up buying YSS PD valves, basically an emulator clone. It wasn't brass, it was aluminium. They didn't come with a variety of springs, but they had a few nice features in the bleed plates, such as a fairly small hole and a couple of little dimples if you wanted to drill bigger holes. One downside was that they were made out of a very soft aluminium and they did wear from the coil spring digging into the decorative anodised aluminium. As the end of the coil spring turned, it gouged out the aluminium and the whole thing looked pretty ugly. Still, I used those for quite a few years with a steel spacer on the PD valve to stop the spring from making aluminium swarf. I saw someone else in Australia, I don't remember who, was making a similar damper rod valve, just a poppet style. The PD valves were hard to buy from the then YSS importer, so we drew up our own version. Our first one was again just a poppet like Kawasaki's carbon control valve, like a Racetech emulator, like a YSS PD valve. We made that in a couple of sizes and used it in Suzuki DR650s. It was a little bit different to an RT emulator, like the YSS valve. It had a fairly small bleed hole and you could drill the bleeds out. It was made of aluminium and hard anodised and had an acetal ring for the spring to sit on, later stainless steel. This was around the 2004 to 2009 period. When we got our first dyno in around 2007, it took us a couple years to work out how to use the dyno effectively on forks and build the jigs for it. Once that happened, I realised how bad our valve actually was. All poppet valves for that matter. Around 2012 or 2013, Tom Foster from Adventure Rider magazine, he had a KLR himself, or maybe a DR, was reading about all these guys fitting various valves to DR forks. Because I'd had a relationship with Tom from when he was the editor of Australasian Dirt Bike and other magazines, Tom asked me, what's the go with all these valves? What do they all do and how do they work? I thought this was a great angle for a technical story, so I bought every valve I could find for a 43mm conventional fork. Racetech emulators, YSS PD valves, Rycor intimidators, a valve from Cogent DDCs, the Plex valve from Full Force Racing in Queensland, which was very popular at the time, and our own V4S valve. Thanks Andrew Martin for the name. I did some testing on Suzuki DR650 forks on the dyno, ran every valve through the dyno and put them into a DR650 to ride. We ended up with a 5-page pretty tech-heavy story for an adventure bike magazine, but it was really interesting to see all the differences. Tom's going to dig up the PDF of it so we can publish it on our website since Adventure Rider magazine is long gone. The result of all the testing was that I decided our own V4S valve was destined for the garbage bin. It didn't perform any worse than any of the other poppet style valves, but really, none of the poppet style valves were particularly good. The Cogent valve was interesting. It used a little shim stack, kind of like a shock piston, but only on compression. I knew the shims on the Cogent valve were prone to bending because I'd seen a few of them in the workshop. With people complaining about performance deteriorating, I'd pull them apart and see that a couple of shims had bent or broken. They bent because first there was nothing to limit the deflection of the shims, so they could bend 90 degrees and become permanently deformed. Second, the port size was tiny. In a damper fork you have a very big column of oil trying to be pushed through this tiny valve, which needs to be considered in design. I used to limit the backward travel of DDC valves, which saved the shims, but the valve didn't perform as well as I thought it could. I looked at every valve I tested and concluded that they all had merit in different ways. Probably the Full Force Racing Plex valve was the best performing valve I tested. The Intimidator was interesting. It had sealing bands on the outer and I really wanted the inertia valve to work, but the inertia valve had a bad habit of not being where you wanted it to be. Its own inertia worked against it. The issue with all these valves is as soon as you try to make rebound damping, you're using the air spring to push oil through the valve, which on the surface sounds like a terrible idea, a hydraulic and engineering nightmare. I'm not going to disagree, I think that's right. However, if you look at how having a piston on top of a damper rod with shims on both sides works at low speed, up to about 300mm per second on the dyno, it is remarkably good. It's only once the velocity exceeds that the concept falls apart. It doesn't fall apart to the point where it's horrific compared to some cartridge designs, which also perform terribly at higher speeds. When I say higher speeds, I'm only talking about half a metre per second, so it's not much. For something that's a pretty cheap and cheerful drop-in component compared to a full-on cartridge, some shortcomings were acceptable. In essence, I took the concept of the Plex valve, which only had shims on the compression side, and I used a 12mm post and changed the post size to 6mm. Moving to the smaller post let us use far more of the shim as the spring. That made the valve much more tunable. Instead of relying on a relatively stiff, short section of shim, we could control the damping with the entire shim stack, just as you would in a modern shock or cartridge fork. I then added a rebound specification, so we now have shims on both sides with a 6mm post. To address the damper rod's notorious sealing issues, I added 2 PTFE piston bands. This way we don't have to rely on the seal on top of the damper rod at all, which was a problem with those types of valves where we relied on the OEM seal being good. We decided to completely bypass that and use our own bands to try to make this thing seal. We now have a valve that sits on top of the damper rod in exactly the way that a spring does, and the damper rod sits in the centre because it's guided by the PTFE bands. No adapters required in most cases. I was a little concerned about how these PTFE bands would wear over time, so we got one of our customers with a DR650 who did a lot of kilometres to put it in his bike for a year to see how the bands would wear and whether they could keep the valve body away from the moving fork tube. Our first lot of valves were made of brass with an electroless nickel coating, which we liked because it was really hard and meant we didn't need any additional platforms between the valve and the top of the damper rod or the valve and spring. As for the actual design of the ports, I did a very average drawing on paper and gave it to our then mechanical engineer Brendan. I said, I reckon it needs to look like this. Brendan drew it up, assuming we were going to hand machine it out of aluminium or brass, and we put it on the dyno to test it. I said, it'll be fine, this thing doesn't have to be that complex. We worked out the port area for a 43mm fork because one of the issues with the damper fork is the sheer volume of fluid that the chrome tube pushes through the ports. We made the ports as large as we practically could while keeping costs down by just doing a circular port. It has identical ports on rebound and compression, something Brendan was sceptical of and I viewed as a fairly blunt instrument. I think we made 50 of them in the first run and he thought I was nuts. The first lot of PTFE bands were endless bands and I cut them with a razor blade to work out how much bleed we needed through the bands. Early on, we realised we didn't have enough bleed, which was great. It was fantastic to go from a fork with way too much bleed and no control to now controlling the bleed so well we needed more. It's always easier to add more bleed than to try to control excessive bleed in a damper. Once we settled on the PTFE bands, I still had to add a bleed shim under the main shim stack on both the rebound and the compression sides because it still made way too much damping. From there, it probably only took about 10 different specifications before we ended with something quite good that we could test. One of the really nice things about the valve design is that the 6mm shim is something all of our suspension tuning customers have. So even if they decide they don't like the specification Technic has given them and want to do something else, they easily can. It's just a shoulder bolt. They can unscrew it, change the specs, put it back together. That was one of the areas of the poppet style valve that I didn't really like. In fact, I missed this part earlier. What we found with the poppet valve was that changing the spring rate made very little difference. The biggest difference was preload. You could make astronomically more difference by changing the poppet spring preload than by changing the spring rate. Recently, one of my friends has a 1986 Yamaha TT350 that he runs in vintage enduros. Another tuner had used Racetech emulators in it. My friend John rode around for about a year saying it's just not that good, it doesn't turn that well. The rear shock on his bike, the same suspension tuner had done it, was a funny little Yamaha hydraulic product, not actually a KYB. I took it on as a project because this friend is also my business coach, so I figured I owed him. I ended up buying another second-hand TT350 shock and built one good shock out of the two. He was very happy with the rear because he owned one of these bikes when it was new. He said now the rear feels exactly the way it did when the bike was new. I can understand that because I've now tested enough of them to know on the dyno how they should look, and his looks exactly how they did when new. He asked me to do something about the front and I put in one of our new 41mm valves, which we'd only just made. We called it a platinum valve because we couldn't think of anything else. It was a goofy name that stuck. Our previous valve was called a V4S valve, which stood for Valve for Shitbox. That was something we always kept very quiet where people asked where V4S came from. We just said it was an internal engineering code. My friend has now done a vintage enduro and loves the fork. He says it's fantastic, it doesn't dive, it's lost that busyness it had, doesn't bottom out on jumps anymore, and he has a lot more feel in the front end. He says it's magic. We did nothing else but put our platinum valve in. No change to spring rates, oil height, nothing else. Just the valve out of the box. Our platinum valve does cop a fair bit of flack from some tuners who tell everyone in both videos and in person that our valve can't possibly work because we're using negative pressure to try to push oil through it to make rebound damping, and that just cannot work. I agree, it's not the best practice. However, we're trying to keep costs down. Cartridge kits are expensive. On the dyno, it works quite well at low speed. If we look at a histogram of a fork and work out what its mean velocity is, the fork spends a lot of time at low speed. Anything you can do to improve its performance at low speed will have a big impact. Yes, once you get above about 750 mil per second, its performance falls apart, but those instances only happen on reasonable bumps, not every little bit of trail chatter you're riding over. And Greg builds them, what's not to love about that? Every design I tested taught me something, none of them were perfect. The platinum valve is simply the result of taking the best ideas from all of them, fixing the weaknesses where I thought I could, and accepting the limitations you simply can't remove from a damper rod fork. People occasionally ask how it can make rebound damping when it's sitting on top of a damper rod, using air spring pressure and negative pressure to move oil. That's a fair question. It isn't the perfect hydraulic solution, but perfection was never the goal. The goal was to make a damper rod fork work as well as it reasonably can, at a price riders can afford. Thanks for watching and listening. I hope you've learned something, and stay tuned for more videos where we can find out more about the engineering and the trials and tribulations at Technic.